Toda, Shimon. Good morning. As World War II drew to an end, there were 800,000, some say 900,000, but we're not going to argue over 100,000 people, Jews living in the Arab world. Many of these Jewish communities had roots going back to antiquity, before most of what today are called Arab countries had any Arabs, and I would add here, before Muslim but non-Arab Turkey had any Turks. The collapse and dissolution of this venerable diaspora was rapid. Within a mere 2 decades following the establishment of the State of Israel, the overwhelming majority of Jews from Iraq in the east to Morocco in the west left their lands of origin and primarily went to Israel and France, but also to Western Europe and the Americas. And today there's only a tiny, vestigial, and for the most part moribund remnant of no more than 3,500 souls that have been left behind, and these are mostly in Morocco and Tunisia. In Israel, Jews from Arab lands and their descendants now make up over half of the population, and they've put their own distinctive stamp on Israel's evolving society. And in France, they now constitute the majority of French Jewry, and there too their impact has been profound. They've transformed and revived French Jewry, which had been decimated by the Holocaust and by rampant assimilation. Now, the Arab-Israeli conflict may have been a catalyst for this mass exodus of Jews from the Arab countries. In the Maghreb, the end of French colonial rule was a major contributing factor, and in Yemen there was a genuine wave of messianic enthusiasm, which to a certain degree existed elsewhere as well. But the Arab-Israeli conflict was by no means the sole cause for the departure of the Jews of the Islamic world. The underlying forces that paved the way and contributed to this seemingly sudden rupture had been at work since the dawn of the modern era and were part and parcel of the impact of the West and the process of modernization that affected both Jews and Arabs, albeit in very different ways. Without getting into an arid discussion of just when the modern era began in the Arab and wider Islamic world, I would just observe that from the end of the 18th century throughout the 19th and the 20th, and indeed in many parts of that culture zone to this very day, the growing economic, political, and cultural intrusion of the West had been perceived as a serious threat by the majority Muslim community, whereas by Jews and most native Christians, it was viewed as a liberation from their traditional humble status as Ahl Adhimma, people of the Pact of Protection, that is, protégés. Now, in the heyday of the Dar al-Islam, the Islamic domain, which was from the mid-9th to the mid-13th centuries, and during the first century of Ottoman rule in the Arab world, the 15th century, the Islamic social and legal system governing Christians and Jews was, by pre-modern standards, a relatively tolerant one that allowed a good deal of religious and economic freedom and internal communal autonomy, but which since the later Middle Ages had been narrowly interpreted and rigorously imposed with discriminating taxes, identifying and often humiliating dress codes, what they call riyar, differentiation in Arabic, and in many places, ghettoization. The Malah in North Africa, in Morocco, the Hara, the Qat al-Yahud, the Mahal, they had different names in different places. And in some countries, Jews were subject to corvée labor, sukhra. Both Jews and Christians were quick to see that the increased European intervention and penetration in their part of the world meant a weakening of traditional Islamic norms of society and could only better their own position, which was traditionally one of religiously and legally defined inferiority. In the words of the Quran, al-maskana wal-dhul. But this insider-outsider status had permitted non-Muslims to fill a variety of functions that Muslims chose not to. One of these was to serve as intermediaries between European commercial interests in the Middle East and North Africa and the surrounding Muslim society. The large number of Sephardi and Livornese Jews in the ports and interior commercial centers, with their knowledge of Spanish and Italian, their willingness to learn foreign languages, and their connections with co-religionists in Europe, and somewhat later with India and the Far East, and even the New World, were particularly prominent in this role. And furthermore, they were regarded by their local Islamic societies as being eminently suited to the disagreeable, though necessary, task of having extended intercourse with foreign infidels. This comprador class was, to be sure, an elite minority. The large number of Jews were poor, in some places the overwhelming majority. But throughout the last 4 decades of the 19th century and the first half of the 20th, many Jews began to avail themselves of the benefits of a modern European education provided by the various cultural and religious missionaries who flooded into the Middle East and North Africa. For Jews, the Alliance Israélite Universelle, the AIU, the first international Jewish aid organization founded in Paris in 1860, became the chief provider of modern education in the major towns and cities of most of the Arab countries from the 1860s on, and it had this motto of émancipation par éducation, emancipation through education. French, rather than Arabic, became the language of high culture for thousands upon thousands of Jews. With the notable exception of Iraq and 1 or 2 individuals in Egypt, Jews were singularly unattracted to the Nahda, the literary Arabic revival, which was in some ways parallel to the Hebrew Haskalah. By 1900, it was estimated that over 100,000 pupils had received an AIU education in the Ottoman Empire alone. The Alliance gave its pupils, which by the way included both boys and girls, far more than a modern education. It gave them a new self-image, quite different from that of the humble dhimmi. It gave them a new mobility. Jews left areas of lesser economic development for greater ones within the Arab world. For example, from Syria and Morocco to Egypt after the building of the Suez Canal, and to Europe and South America. In fact, until the end of the Second World War, the majority of Jews in Venezuela were from North Morocco. And Venezuela's, I don't know if he's the only one, but he certainly is one of the very few winner of the Nobel Prize. Dr. Benzaken in chemistry is of that Moroccan ancestry. The Alliance created new expectations within its students and helped to arouse a sense of international Jewish solidarity. The name of the organization in Hebrew was Kol Yisrael Chaverim, all Israel are friends. Ironically, although it was officially neutral and privately hostile to the Zionist movement prior to World War II, the AIU actually fostered widespread receptivity towards Zionism by including modern Hebrew as part of its curriculum and having youth organizations such as the Scouts and others which were pro-Zionist, making use of their facilities. Sometimes they were not happy about it. The AIU produced cadres of modern, educated Jews who had a distinct advantage of opportunity over the largely uneducated Muslim masses as the Islamic and Arab lands were being drawn ineluctably into what the sociologist and my former colleague at Binghamton, Emanuel Wallerstein, has dubbed the modern world economic system. They filled lower and middle level positions in the new sectors of the economy, banking, insurance, transport, and other services. They very rarely reached the highest levels, which actually were very often Europeans. Together with the rapidly evolving native Christians who benefited from missionary schools, and some Jews did go to them as well, Jews came to have a place in the economic life of the Middle East and North Africa that was far out of proportion to their numbers or social status in the general population. And as the economic historian Charles Issawi has pointed out, They were to pay for these Western ties, their Western acculturation, and their economic success, which was deeply resented by the Muslim Arab majority. This conspicuous overachievement by some Jews and Christians would contribute to their undoing as a group in the 20th century with the rise of militant nationalism in the Arab world. Rapid acculturation, overachievement in certain economic spheres, and a weakening of tradition among some of the more modern and Western-educated Jews may at first glance seem to be parallel to the emergence of European Jewry from the ghetto. However, in Europe, the emancipation and modernization of Jews resulted in greater assimilation into the surrounding culture. But in the Islamic world, the result was quite the opposite. Jews therefore became further alienated from the society around them. Although Arabic-speaking Jewry had never been totally a part of Arab culture, it nevertheless shared many more cultural elements with its Muslim neighbors prior to the modern era than did its European brethren with their Christian compatriots. But the Jews of Arab lands had no vested interest in the old social and political order of their traditional Muslim overlords. Therefore, they welcomed European political and economic domination that began with the French conquest of Algeria in the 1830s and culminated in the carving up of the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I. It was their misfortune to discover that the hopes they placed in their British, French, and Italian masters would be disappointed or downright betrayed again and again. In the 19th century, the European powers had sought to extend their protection to the non-Muslim minorities, in part out of a sincere sense of do-gooding, and in part to gain greater influence in the region. But once much of the Middle East and North Africa were under direct European control in the 20th century, the colonial and the mandatory authorities were frequently more concerned with appeasing and, or at least not offending, the Muslim majority than in protecting the Jewish and Christian minorities, especially as the tide of Arab and Islamic nationalism began to rise and swell. It was this powerful tide that would eventually engulf and destroy the Jewish and some of the Christian communities in the Arab world. Sadly, this destructive tide continues to batter Christian communities in Iraq, in Syria, and Egypt in our own day, with the present instability plaguing the region. Man salaf as-sabt laqa al-had quddamuh. After Saturday is past, one will encounter Sunday. This is an Arabic proverb with totally different original meaning, but which has come to be a popular cry in some circles for after the Saturday people, the Sunday people. As it happens, the Saturday people have all left, and it's the Sunday people who are receiving the brunt of the violence today. It has been suggested at times that Jews failed to hear the call of Arab nationalism when they had a chance. On the contrary, they heard it only too well. There never really was a place for them in the militant national movements with their strong pan-Arab and pan-Islamic overtones. Furthermore, from 1929 onward, time of the so-called Wailing Wall riots, Arab nationalism became increasingly anti-Zionist. Despite frequent disclaimers, it became increasingly difficult for either nationalist leaders or the Muslim Arab population at large to differentiate between Yahud, Jews, and Sahayana, Zionists. And the two terms become interchangeable. Growing Arab admiration for German National Socialism and for Italian fascism in the 1930s and 1940s, and a concomitant receptivity to their anti-Semitic rhetoric also ensured that Jews would find no place for themselves in the Arab nationalist camp and the society it would create. And to this day, the protocols of the Elders of Zion and Mein Kampf, expurgated of its anti-Arab lines are bestsellers in many parts of the Arab world. World War II demonstrated to the Jews of Arab lands with painful clarity just how vulnerable they were. In Iraq, during the pogrom of June 1 and 2, 1941, known as the Farhud, Jews had seen the kind of violence that could be visited upon them under a native regime. For 2.5 months, Iraq was allied with the German Axis. In Italian Libya and the French Maghreb, they saw what anti-Semitic colonial rule could do to them, while much of the native Arab population looked on with indifference. There were exceptions, as Robert Satloff has documented in his important book, Among the Righteous, but these were few and far between. They could only imagine what might have befallen them if King Farouk had been able to welcome Rommel into the country as he had hoped to do prior to the defeat of the Germans at El Alamein. The lessons of the Holocaust in Europe was not lost upon most of the Jews of the Arab world either. They emerged from their wartime experience with a heightened sense of Jewish consciousness and esprit de corps. The North African Jews, who comprised well over half of all the Arabic-speaking Jewry, referred to their own retour sur soi, their return to self. Among young people in particular, there was an increased receptivity to Zionism as the ultimate answer to the anti-Semitism of both European colonists and the Arab nationalists. Events moved rapidly in the years immediately following World War II, and in short order totally undermined the already weakened underpinnings of the Jewish communities in the Arab world. It made little difference whether Jews abjectly mouthed the Arab anti-Zionist line as in Syria, donated generous sums of money to the Palestinian cause as in Iraq, publicly proclaimed their loyalty as in Egypt, or completely identified themselves with the colonial power as in Algeria, or for that matter, openly declared their allegiance to Zionism as in Tunisia and Libya. In the end, they all shared a similar fate and chose to emigrate or flee from the lands of their birth.